Tenakoto Kato. Welcome back to the season premiere of The Youth Factor, where we aim to see the world through the lens of the future. I'm your host, Alex Jung, and I hope to take you on a virtual journey around the world where stories untold will be shared, current issues will be discussed, and the voices of the youth will be heard. I'm thrilled to bring it back for season 2 after a year's time, and it's extremely relevant to bring it back, especially amid so many global crises happening around the world, whereby the youth voice and the intellectual discussion youth must engage in has become an utmost priority. So, to kickstart this season off, the season's journey begins in Europe. Known as the Land of Stones, this country is filled with ancient history of a unique world treasury full of great civilizations' chronicles, must see places of interest, and vast nature. A nation of unity and willingness to support each other in hardships could be one of the traits that identifies the people, which also explains the use of brother in the speech, or the word Jan, which means dear. The state's historical symbol is the mountain Ararat, and it has cuisine distinguishable flavors, including dishes like horovat, kash, krapama, and harissa. Today, we explore Armenia, and joining me today is our guest, Aren Hakhverdyan. Aren is a fellow alum from Lipochin United World Colleges and from Dilijan in northern Armenia. His goal is to integrate his culture and identity into his future professional career as an illustrator or graphic designer and work with international artists and exhibition centers. Welcome, Aren, to the podcast.
Hi, Alex. It's a big pleasure to be here.
So, could you begin?
Um,
Oh, yeah.
yeah. So my name is Aren. Currently I'm 19. As Alex mentioned, I'm from Dilijan and northern Armenia. My hobbies are playing the guitar. I like to draw sometimes, and sometimes I also play chess, and I'm also interested in like different genres of literature, music, and films.
Wonderful. Well, I'm very honored to have you on the podcast, Aren, and excited to explore Armenia because we haven't actually had many guests from this part of the world, so it's definitely something new.
Yeah.
So let's dive right into our topics. So the first topic is about the limitation of progress in Armenia as a result of nationalistic and religious ideals. So upon reading the 2011 Nationalist Discourse in Armenia article written by Hrant Mikhailian, it is clear that there is a strong nationalistic sentiment amongst Armenians, with the study looking at the nation's perception and relationship with other states. This includes the ongoing tensions with the Turks and Azerbaijanis, the distrust in the international system, and the strong ties with Russia. So, could you begin by contextualizing this issue of how nationalism prevents the development of the state? And perhaps you could touch upon your own personal experiences and encounters.
Yeah, I think nationalism is pretty much the something that can describe our state we are in currently, because a lot of Armenians do not trust the international system and like Western world, and a lot of Armenians do not have motivation of learning, for example, like English or being interested in communicating with abroad, like people from abroad. And I think it's mostly connected with educational system we have now and the mindset we have as Armenians, because we are all pretty and like we try to emphasize the, for example, in education system, the subjects that are connected to like Armenian literature, Armenian history. Like for my example, like for instance, when I was studying in high school in Armenia, my teacher decided to study only Armenian history for our class instead of worldwide history, because for that like educational system decided to put only Armenian history as exam, but not the world history, and she decided that it would be more beneficial for us to study that.
Mhm. Yeah. So you touch on about the kind of educational system and the structures that are in place that is preventing this form of progress. So could you maybe elaborate a bit more on how this directly kind of destroys creativity and critical thought that emerges from the youth population, which is the generation that should be leading the country forward?
Yeah, I think. one of the biggest mistakes that our educational system has developed from Soviet Union educational system is that it's pretty mechanized. Like a lot of Armenians, when they go to school, the dynamic between the teacher and students pretty clear. Like teacher is not some like it's not a friend as it's supposed to be. Teacher is someone like instructor and is always above the student, and and I don't think they provide the same amount of motivation or objectives of the school material that is supposed to be. Um, and additionally, I would mention that there are no teamworks or something analytical in the classes.
Mm,
Um, for me, like for example, I've studied Armenian literature, and when I went to LPC to study the same like Armenian literature, but like there remotely, it's kind of like really different for me because back home, like in school books we would study like the author's biography, then the analysis of his books like written by the author of the school book, and it would be like weird because it's like there's no analytical or critical thinking like for provided for Armenian students, and we just I think it's pretty mechanized how we study something written down by the author of the school book. We have to learn it like approximately like by heart, and then tell to the teacher, and that's how it's graded.
mm. So I think it's kind of that more rote learning where you're just like you kind of fed something and you're just kind of told to regurgitate that out and just repeat that, and that's the
Yeah, because yes, sorry, it's like even for history there are no like different perspectives. It's only the perspective that the government wants us to know, and it's also interesting like how they word some phrase like some sentences regarding the historical events that also can um like they don't really let us think um uh, how it happened or like the way like how to say it like it could happen from different perspectives of the countries, but we only know the Armenian side.
Mm, mm. So yeah, you've kind of talked about and touched upon this idea of progress being limited by this kind of very specific way in which things are structured. If we look at the kind of nationalism part of it, we see in history and we see in many different case studies that oftentimes shared pains and experiences fuel nationalism. It's a very big causation of it. And Armenia experienced one of the greatest horrors of modern history, which is the Armenian genocide during World War One. And if the viewers aren't familiar with that, definitely recommend that you do some research on it because it is just one of those very eye-opening cases in history. What role do you think that this genocide in particular might have had upon Armenian nationalism? And if there's any other events in Armenian history, you kind of mentioned the Soviet Union, the impact of that as well, that would be vital in understanding the causes of such heightened nationalism.
As you mentioned, the nationalist has a big impact on the youth and new generations, and it's mostly formed from the previous generations. And nationalism is the big scar of our nation that we have from not only genocide but many other cases. For example, like genocide happened. It was caused by the centuries of occupation and limitation of our human rights by Ottoman Empire, and also similar happened by Persian Empire and all the empires and kingdoms we were occupied by. And I think the nationalists we have now, um, like there's this phrase that says uh, hard times or like times of hardship create strong people. I think that's how Armenians lead by. They always try to be strong, and it can be read in their personalities as well, like short-tempered, like proud of their their past and their history, and always trying to um, show others that we are great, like we've been great, like we are, in the past we had like great kingdoms, great history, like we have great cuisine, and we always try to compensate our the the poor political state and poor economical state by what we used to have.
Mm,
And in many cases, the it was caused by the persecutions of us being Christians during Ottoman Empire, and the hates and like the tension that we used to have with Turks and, like, for example, like Persians and Russian Empire over centuries before we gained our independence in the beginning of 20th century.
mm, yeah. So I can see that there's a lot that kind of just compounds, and like you said, it's generational and it kind of passes forward and creates that kind of nationalism and that rhetoric there. So we've talked about how education is a form that limits progress, and that's more of a kind of a passive, indirect form of indoctrination. But there's a quote from Einstein that I came across on the internet. I can't even believe that Einstein said this, but nationalism is nothing more than an idealistic rationalization for militarism and aggression. And this is kind of the manifestation of nationalism that is what's so terrifying about what happens in the world. An ongoing tragedy and horror is the Nagorno-Karabakh, that has its roots from 1988. The most recent development being the Azerbaijani offensive in September last year, and of course the tension and fighting just continues on today. So could you expand more upon then what this means, the future implications of this conflict upon both Armenian nationalism and militarization? And what do you think are the appropriate ways for the international community to react and empathize with the development of this conflict?
To answer the question, I would like to start with the context of the conflict between Armenia and Azerbaijan, the matter of Nagorno-Karabakh, that has been um, a big matter for both nations over many decades, and it's raised its peak in end of 80s when um, there was this movement of perestroika in Soviet Union, which means reconstruction by Gorbachev, and many Armenians strive to more reforms, and they started their movements for Nagorno-Karabakh to rejoin Armenian state or to be independent from Azerbaijan. However, Azerbaijanis did not like it, and the conflict raised to its peak by the beginning of 90s, when um, the both borders started shooting each other, and um, it had its big impact. The conflict had its big impact upon Armenian national militarization, starting from the fact that Armenians do not like Azerbaijanis and Azerbaijanis do not like Armenians. Like, for example, for me, I've been told from a young age that, like, when I'm gonna see like Azerbaijani, they can try to kill me or they can hate me, and I think the roots of conflict are gonna have a big implication in the future generations, and I don't even think that the uh, the connection between Armenians and Azerbaijanis are gonna be stable in current in soon like century, because the like when I like, for example, when I talk to Armenians and I try to justify some, like, not the government but like people, uh they mention that, like, oh, what if that person's brother or like sister or relative killed one of your Armenian relatives, and that's what hinders us to like have negotiation with Azerbaijanis and like talk to them without hate. And the nationalism that we have against Azerbaijanis developed the militarization and the economical state we are in. We try to apply a lot of budget and militarization that prevents from the democracy we have now.
Mm,
Um, and the biggest impact that international community have has reacted over this time is some words of uh, grief or some words of disobedience to what Azerbaijan has done. But however, I don't really think that it has big impact for the conflict that we have now. Like I've heard a lot of American politicians talking about, oh, like Azerbaijan we should commit like some sanctions, and they're like preventing from human rights. Like many of these American politicians have their own benefits. Like saying these words, they just try to have their uh, some like benefits from the war to get reelected or something like that. For other countries, I would say that they do not really like to react to that the way it's supposed to be on even medias, because Western world tries to have stable relation with Azerbaijan because Azerbaijan provides a lot of oil and natural gas to Europe, and if Azerbaijan will be able to blackmail the Western world in this way, we will never achieve some kind of resolution to the problem.
And I think this is why this conflict has just lasted this long, and there's not been many positive developments from here that have gotten anywhere close to any form of peace at this stage. But yeah,
Yeah. Moreover, I would say that it was created by the big countries. Soviet Union created uh, the the problem, because when it came to the point that Soviet Union, like Stalin, had to divide and separate the territories between the countries. He gave like big part to Azerbaijan due to its economical connection to Azerbaijan rather than national national identity of residents in Nagorno-Karabakh.
all right, we'll kind of change courses then, and we'll move on to the second topic of discussion, which is about gender-based violence and abuse against women in Armenia. So, Human Rights Watch reported 391 criminal cases of domestic violence, and that were brought to trial in 2022, keeping in mind that the unreported number is significantly larger, and only 53 resulted in indictment, which often seems to be the case when it comes to gender-based violence, that not a lot of them actually get convicted for it. A 2011 OSCE study claimed that 60% of Armenian women have experienced domestic violence in their lifetime. So, what are these kind of societal structures and or potential religious kind of conservatism that makes these violence rates so high in Armenia?
I think the main reason of this social structure is the patriarchal system that Armenia is currently in. And when we talk about the structure, the patriarchal structure we are in, I should mention the traditions we have, that usually in the Armenian family, man is the master and woman can disobey to Armenian man, and she should be like a housekeeper, and she can't really talk about the issue of, like, if domestic violence happens in Armenian family, women that does not have any rights to talk about it outside of their house, because it's like they can't really report it to police either. It's inside family issues, and why they would um, talk about this outside of the house. And it's pretty common thing in Armenia for men to be like more, to have like toxic masculinity and try to be dominant, because it's stick to traditions. And um, when men are like more short tempered or trying to be dominant or being strong, like sometimes even not showing their emotions, it is a common thing. And when kids in the house see that how like dominant men would act, they would try to make their even their sisters, or like they would try to like youngsters, they would try to make their sisters like listen to them, and even their mothers be
Mm,
more obedient.
mm. So you talk about tradition and stuff like that. Do you think there's some like religious relation to that because of the Catholic identity, or is it just more of a kind of a generational thing that is passed down and hasn't really been reformed?
I think it's more generational thing than connected to beliefs, because because back then, before the economical changes, like in 20th century, for industrialization and modernization of Armenia, like of Western world, like people would a man would be ready to go to war, and it's also connected to the many wars that Armenia has been like in over many centuries, and men are expected to go to work while women needs to take care of their children. And I don't think like that has changed over many years that we are now. And many men just they just try to reject the modernization. And yeah, and modernization, like we can't really shift to modernization due to the inclusivity of Armenians, when they're like, oh, why would this, let's say, Americans do this? Like we are Armenians, we know how to do this, and we'll do our changes and reformations on our ways.
Mm. So it seems so clear that law enforcement and NGO activity to protect the rights of women is very little. I mean, we saw the statistic that 400 criminal cases were brought to trial and only 50 of them have resulted in some form of conviction. So, what do you think are the urgent changes required at this stage? And why do you think legislative protection in Armenia is quite weak in protecting the rights of women?
Hmm. I think the main reason can be the low reinforcement, that it's so weak that at this point we can't really change the way people think and the mindset of people. And I think that the organizations that protect the women's rights should be voiced a lot more in media, and similar to the, like, for example, the environment issues. Armenians try not to talk about this because, like, for example, for women rights, it's a taboo thing. Why would you talk about your family issues? And that's how many Armenian women are even scared to talk about this in media or outside, because it's shameful, like for the outer world to know about this, about the problem of your family. uh, Additionally, they can't even divorce, yeah, because like even especially when they have kids, because it's a shameful act for many women in our country.
Mm. So, kind of like this is a question that will span across two topics, which is one on gender violence and one on political instability. So political instability is rampant in Armenia. There are frequent changes in government and society is very polarized. This is seen relevantly in the context of the responses to the Nagorno-Karabakh conflict. However, I would like to know further how political instability is a factor and that is challenging the welfare of general citizens' human rights, including that of the protection of women.
Well, to start to talk about political instability, we I should mention about the recent years protests, especially like 2018 protests that brought to the rule in the government Nikol Pashinyan, the current prime minister of Armenia. And since 2018, there have been so many protests. I can't recall all of them. Um, and most of them are connected to the Armenian question, like Armenian territory question of Nagorno-Karabakh.
Mm-hmm.
Um, if we should try to stop the conflict for the sake of the youth, or we should just give up on our territories and okay, like okay, on territories, yeah, give up on our territories to Azerbaijan or try to find some negotiation. Um, and it brings to disagreement between the government and people, leading to the point where we all just call each other like Turks, which means betrayer in Armenian, like
Oh.
uh, coming from the historical context, yeah, of occupation. So when it comes to the protests, there has been many cases and notes of human violence and
Mm,
many arrests and persecution of journalists,
mm,
um, as and as well as there have been economical stops of growth, leading to increase of the poverty, as
mm,
well as some of the other laws. For example, the protection of women are held back and they are not observed as much as the question of ours being survived through this conflict, like many conflicts.
mm,
And yeah, as well as the rights of Nagorno-Karabakh citizens. Approximately 100,000 Armenians have been displaced from their homes in Nagorno-Karabakh. That also has had its implications in economical state and political state of Armenia.
mm, mm. So kind of right now what's happening is there's a lot of focus on that conflict, but not enough on the actual welfare or the actual citizens' rights, and it's kind of being held back. Is that that's what I'm kind of
Yeah,
getting from your, yeah.
yeah, I think the problem of us being unstable in development is that we try to survive. That's the
Mm,
issue. We try to hold our territories back. We try to hold our youth back. Like we try to find some resolution for this problem, but at the same time, trying to keep our historical territories.
mm, mm. So you've begun to mention the protests and the opposition, especially within the responses to Nagorno-Karabakh. There has been a lot of opposition to the Prime Minister, including Bagrat Galstian, who is an archbishop and a prominent figure in the protests. And there's been a lot of threats of coups as well. So it seems that while this conflict on the outside is actually between Armenia and Azerbaijan, within the Armenian state, there's this kind of interstate conflict going on and a lot of turmoil within that country and contained within itself. So, what is this conflict, or more specifically, the situation in Armenia where we have these very polarized sides? What has this revealed about the political state and structure of the Armenian government, and what reforms do you think need to be made?
Yeah. Well, it's kind of ridiculous and shameful to accept the fact that when we watch the live videos of the government and how they're mm, making decisions on new laws or discussing some issues of the country, they often hate each other and like the politicians, and they start arguments, they start fighting, and it's kind of wild to watch nowadays. And from the fragility of political state, I would say that there's a lot of like from what we've seen from the conflict, there's a lot of over reliance on nationalism, military power.
Mm,
um, and what I think we should do is try to achieve more democratic and like integration of the people in decision making.
mm,
And um, there's also been like some accusations of justice forces and them being more independent, leading to a more the bigger level or the bigger level of corruption.
Mm,
And I think the only way we can try to change the formed state of the rule of law we have now is to well, the others would say it's change the government, but I think it's not the best decision here. Is to try to find like to stricten the laws, of course, but like it's kind of hard to answer right now.
mm, mm. I guess when you talk about people being more involved in decision making, I guess right now that comes in the form of protest. Is that's the authentic people's voice. It's them trying to say what they want. But when you have these protests being shut down, that's kind of the government's way of really separating the people and politics there. I'm a bit more curious about the nature of these protests, about what these protesters are really asking for. What are those kind of main objectives or drivers behind these protests? And so many of them.
The protests have raised their voice on the fact of the current problem with Azerbaijan, like that the prime minister Pashinyan tries to negotiate with Azerbaijan, and he's ready to give away the new territories, which are the four villages of the region Tavush, which I'm from, uh, which are board like these four villages borders with Azerbaijan, and according to Azerbaijan, according to all reports, it has been under Azerbaijan territories before Soviet Union, as far as I know.
Mm,
But they want to return them, and um, Prime Minister Pashinyan, he's ready to give away these territories for the sake of the peacekeeping. However, Bagrat Galsen, who's from Tavush. He started protests, and his argument and lack of communication with the government is that um, he wants to negotiate through um, the protests, and he wants Nikol Pashinyan to resign. That's the ultimate decision he wants to make, and wants to bring the new rule of the government. However, the people do not really support. Like some mass supports him, but as far as I heard, not a lot of people like Pagar Galician, rather calling him a clown than Archbishop. And the problem we have now is that not a lot of people support our prime minister, not a lot of people support Bagar Galician and any other politicians.
mm,
And these protests are just about Armenians shouting for their rights, shouting for them to keep the territories and stop these useless wars.
mm, mm. So then, seeing based upon the sheer number of protests in Armenia, you mentioned this earlier, but there's been a lot of crackdowns against journalism and journalists, and protesters are being met with violence. So, Armenia, in terms of the Freedom in the World Index, which measures the amount of political and social and economic freedom that citizens have, Armenia ranks around 40th in the world, which isn't too bad, but it has been on a consecutive decline for its 18th year consecutively. Their freedom, political freedom, has declined. Um, so how do these responses to protests jeopardize the democratic system of the state? Because it does claim it's a constitutional democracy. And have protests been effective at all in achieving its aims in Armenia?
I won't. I don't think it's we're achieving the aims that we want,
Mm,
because the main problem we have is the lack of communication between the government and the protesters. But protesters want the ultimate decision of Nikol Pashinyan resigning. Well, Nikol Pashinyan he does not want uh, to change his decision, and he understands that if we don't give these territories to Azerbaijan, we will just um, get involved into another war.
Mm,
And in terms of the freedom of speech, it's in recent years is lacking since the a lot of protesters and journalists try to uh, express their concerns. However, many and politicians as well. However, many of them get arrested and get involved into some kind of persecutions, as I mentioned.
mm. Do you feel then, during your lifetime living in Armenia and growing up in Armenia, that the state is becoming less and less democratic? Is there a bigger atmosphere of fear going on in the state? How would you kind of characterize that?
I wouldn't say there's no democracy in Armenia.
Mhm,
There's compared to many like years before and after the independence of Armenia in 1991. There have been a lot of cases of both corruption and the regime of the presidents that try to rule yeah, after their um, end of their previous rule. For example, Serge Sarkisian tried to rule after he tried to become prime minister in 2018. However, it was met by dislike of Armenian nation, leading to Velvet revolution that we discussed today. And compared to those years, I feel Armenia has gone through more of democracy than long before. However, the issue is that the democracy can be declined and the political law enforcement can be also declined, uh, and mostly because of the conflict and people's expectation from what we have now and the failures of allying uh, with Russia now,
mhm,
an international community that is pretty avoidant of the conflict.
mhm. Well, that's all the topics so far. But I want to ask, are there any last words you would like to say about any of the topics we discussed, or just kind of about Armenia that we might have not touched upon in this interview? Or are there any ways we as the youth can make an impact or difference? If there's anything you would like to add or share.
The youth factor that we have nowadays is that we are, as the topics involved and tangled into one podcast we mentioned, they
Mm,
can be only resolved by the youth,
mm,
and the enforcement that we can have by the government on the youth generation is the educational, of course.
mm,
And education is pretty shallow. That's, I think, is pretty shallow, and there's no motivation of some students to even get involved with international community as well, because I think the international the support of international community can be important. However, it's it's really hard to believe that we can get any international support in coming years. However, we should try to develop based on the examples of Western world.
mm,
And yeah,
for sure. Well, thank you once again, Aaron, for joining in this episode and representing Armenia. This wraps up
thank
this
you very
episode
much.
of the Youth Factor. Thank you for tuning in, and I hope you look forward to the next stop of our journey. Thank you very much.